America has many dangerous prisons, but there is one place, hidden behind tall fences and miles of empty land, where stories have escaped for decades, stories that sound unbelievable, stories that officials deny, stories that former staff whisper about only after they retire. This prison developed a reputation not only for violence, not only for isolation, but for something far darker. Experiments carried out on inmates who had no power to refuse, no voice to speak, and no way to escape. This documentary is not built on rumors. It is built on testimonies, old court filings, inspection reports, medical records, and statements from people who lived or worked inside the walls. And when you put these pieces together, a disturbing picture appears, a system that pushed human limits in the name of control, punishment, and sometimes research, even if no one would officially call it that. The prison sits far from big cities, a place chosen on purpose. No houses nearby, no watchful eyes, no reporters wandering around. Only long, empty roads, swamps, fields, and the feeling that whatever happens here stays here. The inmates who arrived knew immediately that they were entering a different kind of world. A world where officers followed rules written nowhere, where punishments were stronger than anything described in policy books, and where the word experiment didn't mean science. It meant survival tests. Some of the earliest known cases came from medical units inside the prison. Inmates reported that they were given drugs without being told the purpose. They were told it was routine. They signed papers they couldn't read. Some said they woke up feeling strange, unable to think clearly, or unable to move for hours. Others said they were part of pain response studies, where officials recorded how long they could endure certain conditions. These programs were always small, quiet, and quickly shut down whenever outside attention appeared. But the most disturbing claims didn't come from the medical wing. They came from the isolation blocks. Inside these blocks, inmates described being kept in rooms with constant bright lights, or freezing temperatures, or extreme heat. Not for hours, but sometimes for days. Some said the goal was to test how long the human body could handle environmental stress. Others believed the goal was psychological, to break down inmates who refused to follow orders or who were suspected of gang leadership. A former officer said it simply. They wanted to see what pressure does to a person. He never used the word experiment, but everything he described sounded like one. Then there were the food studies. Several lawsuits accused the prison of serving special meal trays designed to test behavior changes, extremely calorie-low diets, meals with unusual chemical additives, or food blocks meant to push inmates into weakness or obedience. Officials always denied it, saying it was disciplinary food. But former kitchen workers said the recipes were not normal, the ingredients were not standard, and the instructions came from people who never worked in food service. Over time, more stories came out. Stress tests involving loud noise played for hours. Sleep disruption used to control violent inmates. Behavior observation programs disguised as anger management. Medical screenings that gathered data never explained to inmates. Chemical exposure used during emergency response drills. Individually, these events might seem like simple discipline methods, harsh punishments, or medical mistakes. But put together, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Someone inside this system wanted to push human boundaries. Someone wanted to study control. What makes this even more shocking is how all of it stayed hidden for so long. No large investigations. No national headlines. No major lawsuit exposing everything. The secrecy worked because the prison sits in a place where people already expect brutality. When outsiders hear stories of violence, they shrug. When they hear about experiments, they say it sounds too extreme to be true. For decades, that silence protected the institution. But now, former inmates are older. Former staff are retired. Documents once locked away have slowly become available. And the truth that is emerging shows what happens when a prison becomes so powerful, so isolated, and so feared that it can test human limits without anyone asking questions. In this documentary, we are going to break down what really happened inside these walls. How inmates were chosen for tests. What procedures were carried out behind closed doors? Why officers and nurses stayed quiet? How the prison justified actions that sounded illegal? And how the victims survived an environment designed to push them to the edge. This is not a story about one bad officer or one cruel warden. This is a story about a system, a system that allowed secret methods of control to grow slowly, quietly, and dangerously. Some programs lasted weeks. Others lasted years. Many were never documented. But the effects never left the people who lived through them. Inside America's most dangerous prison, survival was not just about avoiding fights, gangs, or punishment. It was about surviving the experiments they tried so hard to keep hidden. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now let's step inside. Long before any secret programs began, long before inmates started speaking out, the prison was already designed in a way that made control easy and silence almost guaranteed. To understand how experiments could happen here, you must understand the place itself, its history, its structure, and the mindset of the people who ran it. The prison was built in a remote rural area for one main reason. Distance means power. When the nearest town is miles away, and when the nearest reporter is even farther, a prison becomes its own world. It becomes a world with its own rules, its own language, its own culture. For inmates, it means isolation. For staff, it means authority. For the system, it means very little oversight. From the outside, the prison looked like many others. High fences, razor wire, guard towers. But the deeper you went inside, the more different it became. The buildings were arranged in long blocks that made movement tightly controlled. Every hallway had blind corners. Every door had heavy steel plates. Inside the segregation wings, sound barely traveled. A person could scream, argue, or cry, and no one more than a few cells away would ever hear them. That silence was not an accident. Silence was part of the design. When the prison opened, officials said it was built for America's most dangerous inmates. People serving long sentences. People classified as violent. People who caused problems in other prisons. This label gave the institution freedom to use extreme security measures. Many visitors never questioned the methods because they assumed the inmates were the worst of the worst. That reputation created the perfect cover for deeper abuses to go unnoticed. In the early years, the prison struggled with violence. Fights broke out almost daily. Officers were attacked. Inmates stabbed each other. Gangs formed quickly. To solve this, the administration created strict behavioral systems. They introduced new control units, new punishment blocks, and new protocols. They called them security upgrades. But inside these upgrades, some staff members saw opportunity. The first people to notice unusual things happening were medical workers. They were the ones who received inmates after long isolation stays, after sudden mental breakdowns, or after unexplained physical symptoms. Some complained privately that officers were using strategies that had no clear purpose. Others said certain inmates were brought in repeatedly with similar issues: confusion, dizziness, emotional collapse, even though their medical records showed no history of illness. Still, no one reported anything publicly. In the prison world, speaking out meant risking your job or being labeled as a problem by your coworkers. Many staff members believed that the harsh methods were necessary. Others didn't want to get involved. Silence grew deeper. Meanwhile, inmates noticed changes too. They saw that some prisoners were removed quietly. They saw officers escort certain individuals to parts of the prison no one else visited. Sometimes the inmates returned days later acting different, calm, unfocused, or afraid to talk. Other times, they didn't return at all. Rumors spread, but inmates knew better than to ask questions directly. Asking the wrong question could lead to punishment. One long-term inmate later said, "We didn't have proof, but we felt something was happening. You could feel it in the air." A major shift came when the prison appointed a warden known for unusual ideas about behavior control. He believed inmates could be retrained through strict environmental conditions, changes in light, noise, temperature, diet, and routine. On paper, this sounded like discipline. But inside the prison, it opened the door for something more experimental. This warden approved new pilot programs, small tests meant to study inmate behavior. Officially, these programs were supposed to reduce violence and improve order. But because they were classified as internal trials, the details never reached the public. Only a handful of officers and administrators knew exactly what was being tested. Most of the prison staff simply followed instructions. Some were told to keep lights on in certain cells for long hours. Others were told to restrict recreation time without writing it down. Others were instructed to monitor inmates' reactions to specific conditions and report the results only to certain supervisors. These tasks looked like normal duties, but they formed the backbone of an unspoken system. The inmates chosen for these tests were not told what was happening. They were simply told that the warden had ordered new discipline procedures. Many obeyed quietly because arguing would lead to punishment. Others resisted, but their resistance only made them more likely to be selected for harsher methods. To the outside world, the prison reported success. Violence dropped. Inmate movement became easier to manage. Staff injuries decreased. The administration called it progress. No one outside knew that the progress came at a human cost. Over time, these early programs evolved. Officers who believed in them rose to positions of authority. Medical staff who complained were ignored or moved. Inmates who protested faced discipline that made their claims seem like excuses. And as the system gained confidence, the experiments grew bolder. The prison's reputation for danger created the perfect shield. Visitors walked through the gates expecting to see harsh treatment. Legislators believed extreme measures were necessary. Inspectors focused on paperwork, not on the places where paperwork did not exist. It was inside this environment, an environment built on isolation, fear, and silence, that the secret experiments began to take shape. The administration never used the word experiment. They called them management programs, security assessments, or behavior evaluations. But for the inmates who lived through them, the purpose felt clear: they were being tested. And in many cases, they were being pushed past normal human limits. This chapter ends where the Real story begins, when the prison crossed the line between strict punishment and something far more controlled, far more organized, and far more hidden than anyone expected. The prison never posted a list. There was no written policy, no official announcement, no document describing who would be chosen and why. Yet inside the walls, everyone understood one truth. Some inmates were watched more closely than others, and those inmates often became the first targets for the prison's special programs. To understand how these selections worked, you need to picture daily life inside a high-security prison. Every inmate is constantly judged, not by their past alone, but by their behavior, their relationships, their attitude, and even their ability to adapt. Officers make notes. Case managers write reports. Intelligence staff scan for signs of gang activity. Medical workers report unusual behavior. Every detail is recorded somewhere, and all of these small pieces are combined to form an inmate's profile. This profile decides everything: where an inmate lives, what privileges they get, how often they can move, and how staff treat them. But in this prison, the profile also decided something far more serious: who was selected for hidden experiments. The first group targeted were inmates labeled high risk. These were people who refused orders, were suspected of being gang leaders, or had reputations for causing problems. Staff believed these inmates needed extra control, which allowed the administration to justify assigning them to new, untested programs. Officials claimed these methods were meant to break gang influence and reduce violence, but nothing was written clearly, leaving huge space for misuse. The second group chosen were inmates with no family, no visitors, and no outside support. These inmates were the easiest to isolate. No one came to check on them. No one filed complaints on their behalf. If they were moved suddenly or kept in unusual conditions, the outside world had no way of knowing. Staff understood this, and some officers quietly admitted years later that selection was intentional. Inmates who lacked outside attention made the perfect subjects. One former sergeant said it plainly: if nobody was looking for you, you were more likely to be picked. The third group were inmates with mental health struggles. These individuals were often misunderstood, poorly treated, or viewed as unpredictable. When they became emotional, confused, or uncooperative, the administration sometimes labeled it as noncompliance instead of a medical issue. This allowed them to place these inmates into strict programs without clear medical justification. Some former mental health workers have said that inmates were moved to experimental conditions when they actually needed treatment, not punishment. But the most surprising group, and the most disturbing, were inmates who followed rules perfectly. These inmates seemed calm. They rarely complained. They kept distance from trouble. To the administration, this made them ideal subjects. Not because they were dangerous, but because their behavior made it easier to measure changes. If a normally quiet inmate suddenly became emotional, withdrawn, or unstable, staff could clearly see the difference. That difference became data. Some former inmates described the selection process as invisible but obvious. They said it felt like officers were scanning the population, searching for specific traits. People who were physically strong, people who were mentally fragile, people who were isolated, people who were feared, people who were respected, people who were easy to intimidate, people who were impossible to intimidate. Each type offered something different to test. Inmates noticed that before someone was taken to a special program, there were usually signs. A certain group of officers would visit the unit more often than normal. A supervisor would walk slowly down the row scanning faces. Nurses would appear unexpectedly to do checkups that weren't on the schedule. A case manager who rarely visited would ask strange questions like, "Have you been sleeping well? Do you get nervous easily? How do you handle stress?" And then, one night, always at night, officers would arrive quietly. They would pull one or two inmates from their cells and take them to parts of the prison most people never saw. Nobody was told where they were being taken. Nobody was told for how long. Nobody was told why. Sometimes the inmates returned days later with a different expression, calmer, quieter, or refusing to speak about where they had been. Other times, they returned angry, confused, or exhausted. Some never spoke about it again, either because they were afraid or because they felt nobody would believe them. For the officers who participated, selection looked different. They were told the inmates were being placed in behavioral evaluation, threat reduction, or special monitoring. These phrases sounded official. They sounded necessary. They allowed officers to justify actions they knew little about. A few officers later admitted they believed they were helping maintain order. Others confessed they didn't want to know the real purpose. The less they knew, the safer they felt. The administration used several methods to hide the selection process. 1. No official paperwork. Movements were logged as temporary. Policies were written in vague language. Reports were marked confidential. Without records, there was nothing for auditors or investigators to question. 2. Rotating staff. Officers were moved between units so that no one had a full picture of the program. By keeping staff confused, the administration kept the system protected. 3. Using emergencies as excuses. If an inmate collapsed, panicked, or reacted badly during a test, staff wrote it up as a medical incident or behavioral disruption, never mentioning the conditions that caused it. 4. Avoiding pattern detection. Selections were spread out over weeks or months. No two wings were targeted at the same time. This made the actions seem random instead of organized. 5. Blaming the inmate. If a selected inmate showed signs of distress, the administration claimed it was due to their own behavior, not the program. This erased responsibility and created doubt. A former officer said, "It wasn't random. It just looked random." For the inmates, the fear was constant. Nobody knew who would be next. Nobody knew what qualified someone for removal. Some inmates tried to stay invisible, hoping not to be chosen. Others became overly compliant, thinking good behavior would protect them. But in reality, neither strategy made a difference. The selection system did not follow normal rules. This chapter ends at the point when enough inmates had been quietly selected that the administration felt confident to move forward with larger programs. They now had groups of individuals they believed they could test, different personalities, different conditions, different reactions. The next step would be the actual experiments themselves. Once the administration knew which inmates they wanted to focus on, the next step moved from quiet selection to controlled testing. These programs were never called experiments inside the prison. Staff used softer terms like evaluations, behavior studies, or special management procedures. But every person who lived through them later described the same thing: conditions designed to push the human mind and body in ways normal prison routines never would. The prison had several hidden areas perfect for these programs. Some were old storage rooms converted into small holding spaces. Others were in used medical observation cells at the back of the infirmary. A few were isolation units built deep inside the facility where almost no sound escaped. None of these places had windows. None were visited by outside researchers or inspectors, and none showed up on the official maps given to volunteers or state visitors. Inside these rooms, the experiments took different forms. 1. Environmental pressure tests. Former inmates described being placed in cells where the temperature shifted in unusual ways. Sometimes the rooms were kept extremely warm for long periods. Other times they were made unusually cold, colder than normal segregation. The purpose was never explained. Officers simply stated the warden wanted inmates acclimated or stabilized. One inmate later said, "It felt like they were checking how long we could handle it before we reacted." Lights were another tool. Some rooms stayed bright all day and all night. No darkness, no dimming, no natural rhythm. Others were kept so dim that inmates could barely see their hands. Both conditions caused confusion, stress, and extreme fatigue. Officers monitored reactions through small windows or cameras, writing down notes without speaking to the inmate. To the administration, this was behavioral observation. To the inmates, it felt like they were being studied like objects. 2. Sensory manipulation. In some cases, inmates reported long periods of silence. Not normal prison silence, but engineered silence. No noise from the hallway. No voices from staff. No movement. Officers purposely closed off nearby sections to cut sound. The effect was unsettling, creating a feeling of complete isolation. Other times, inmates described sudden bursts of noise. Loud fans, constant buzzing, metal doors slamming repeatedly. These sounds made it hard to rest or think. The pattern seemed random, but some former officers later suggested it was deliberate, a way to test how quickly a person lost focus or became agitated. None of these methods appeared in official policy. None were written into disciplinary rules. They simply existed in a hidden layer of prison life. 3. Food and nutrition experiments. Across several years, inmates noticed strange changes in meal trays. Some trays had extremely small portions. Others included ingredients that tasted different from normal prison food. A few described thick, dense food blocks unlike anything served elsewhere. Officially, these trays were called behavior modification meals. Unofficially, kitchen staff said the recipes came from people who didn't work in food service. Some meals appeared designed to reduce energy, lower aggression, or affect mood. Inmates placed on these diets often reported feeling weak, confused, or emotionally flat. They were told it was part of discipline, not something being studied. Former kitchen workers, years later, confessed they were instructed not to discuss the ingredients. 4. Stress endurance protocols. In at least 2 documented periods, inmates were kept awake for extended hours under the label of continuous observation. Officers rotated in and out of the unit, shining lights through windows, tapping on doors, or requiring inmates to stand briefly for welfare checks. The stated reason was safety, but inmates noted that the checks were too frequent and too inconsistent to be standard procedure. Some inmates believed the real purpose was to test stress endurance, to see how long a person could function with limited rest. A few said they struggled to think clearly, forgetting simple details. Others said the exhaustion made them emotional or detached. One inmate explained, "I felt like they were timing my reactions." 5. Psychological observation programs. A separate set of experiments focused on behavior. These programs were introduced as anger control, impulse assessment, or threat level monitoring. In reality, they involved structured routines designed to provoke emotional response. Inmates were given unexpected rule changes, sudden schedule shifts, or confrontational instructions. Officers then reported whether the inmate raised their voice, hesitated, complied immediately, or showed signs of stress. Every reaction became data. The most concerning part was that some inmates were placed in these programs without understanding they were being monitored. They believed officers were simply being strict. They did not realize their responses were being documented and compared. A former officer later said, "We didn't know the full purpose, but we were told to track behavior under pressure." That single sentence matched exactly what inmates said they experienced. 6. Medical data collection. This was the most sensitive area. Some inmates reported receiving medical tests that didn't seem necessary. Blood draws labeled as routine. Vitals checked repeatedly without cause. Psychological questionnaires that asked unusually personal questions. Nurses later reported that some data sheets were sent to supervisors rather than doctors. A few recalled being told to monitor specific inmates closely even when those inmates were perfectly healthy. On paper, these tests looked harmless. In reality, they allowed the administration to track internal changes, mood shifts, sleep patterns, stress responses, all without explaining why. A system hidden in plain sight. What made these experiments so effective and so dangerous was the slow, quiet way they evolved. No single program looked extreme on its own. No single officer had the whole picture. But when you combine environmental pressure, sensory manipulation, nutrition control, psychological testing, and medical tracking, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. It begins to look like a coordinated effort to study human behavior under controlled stress. None of it was done openly. None of it was approved by outside agencies. And none of it was explained to the people who went through it. Inmates who tried to complain were often dismissed as exaggerating. Officers who questioned the methods were told it was necessary for institutional safety. Medical staff who raised concerns found their reports redirected or ignored. Behind closed doors, the prison had created a system where anything could be tested and almost nothing could be proven. This chapter ends at the point where the pressure began to show cracks. When inmates started experiencing lasting effects, when rumors grew louder, and when staff began noticing consequences the administration could no longer hide. For a long time, the administration believed they had full control. They thought the programs were contained, predictable, and invisible to anyone outside the walls. But pressure does not stay hidden forever. When you push human beings beyond normal limits, emotionally, mentally, or physically, consequences eventually reveal themselves. Chapter 4 is where the system began to crack. It started slowly, quietly, not with an explosion, but with small signs that something inside the prison was slipping out of control. Staff noticed that inmates returning from the hidden programs were not acting the same as before. Some became withdrawn and unfocused. Others became strangely calm, almost emotionless. A few reacted strongly to sounds or movements, jumping at things that never bothered them previously. Officers joked about it at first, calling it program shock. But the jokes stopped when the effects didn't fade. One case manager later said, "You could look in their eyes and see something had changed." The administration tried to dismiss these changes. They told staff the inmates were simply adjusting to discipline. They said it was normal. But staff who worked closely with the population knew the difference between normal adjustment and something deeper. The first major shift occurred when inmates began talking among themselves. Even though the programs were designed to isolate participants, small pieces of information leaked out. One inmate whispered to another about the strange lighting. Someone else described unusual food. Another mentioned the constant noise or silence. Even without exact details, the patterns became clear. And patterns create fear. Rumors spread through the prison quickly. Some believed the administration was testing psychological endurance. Others believed they were testing environmental limits. A few believed it was punishment disguised as research. Many inmates stayed silent out of fear, but the fear itself became a warning signal. When a large population starts feeling unsafe, control becomes harder for the staff to maintain. Around this time, medical staff noticed an increase in visits. Inmates began reporting headaches, confusion, difficulty sleeping, or sudden emotional distress. Some described feeling like time passed differently. Others said they couldn't remember simple things. Nurses logged the symptoms, but nobody in upper administration publicly connected the dots. Meanwhile, officers inside the hidden programs began experiencing their own doubts. They were not told the full purpose of the tests, only that they were helping reduce violence and improve order. But seeing the changes firsthand made some of them question what they were actually participating in. One officer later explained, "We were told to watch, record, and not ask questions. But asking questions is the first thing you want to do when you see someone breaking down." Still, nobody spoke up formally. The prison culture discouraged it. Officers feared losing their positions. Nurses feared being ignored or replaced. And inmates feared retaliation. Silence, once again, protected the system. But the real breaking point came when the administration expanded the programs too quickly. They believed they had perfected their methods. They believed they could safely monitor reactions. So they widened the scope, selecting more inmates than before. They began running several programs at the same time. Instead of testing one or two environmental conditions, they tested multiple conditions across different units. This was the moment the system lost control. In one unit, officers noticed several inmates showing similar reactions within the same week: confusion, agitation, emotional changes, unusual silence. In a different unit, inmates complained about identical conditions in separate cells. Staff who never spoke to each other reported similar concerns. A pattern had formed that could no longer be mistaken for coincidence. The prison tried to manage the situation by removing some inmates quietly and replacing them with others. But the more they shifted people around, the more obvious the pattern became to those paying attention. Staff started comparing notes informally. Inmates whispered through vents and recreation cages. Even maintenance workers noticed certain rooms being used more often than usual. The administration responded by tightening secrecy. They restricted staff access. They limited medical checks. They instructed officers to write less detail in logs and to classify movements as routine. But by then, it was too late. The signs of strain were visible. Then came the moment that forced attention. An inmate who had been through multiple hidden programs began behaving in ways staff had never seen from him before. He wasn't violent, but he seemed disconnected from reality. He struggled to follow simple instructions. He repeatedly said he couldn't sleep, even though officers knew he had been awake for extended periods as part of the program. During a routine check, he sat completely still, unresponsive to his name. Officers panicked, thinking something medical was wrong. This incident triggered an internal medical emergency. Nurses rushed in. Supervisors were called. Reports were filed. And for the first time, the unusual conditions could not be dismissed as normal behavior. The administration tried to explain it away as a mental health crisis, but several staff members who knew about the hidden programs privately disagreed. One nurse described the moment simply. He wasn't the same person who walked into that unit a week earlier. The administration faced a problem. If the incident drew outside attention, inspectors or investigators might ask questions about the programs. So instead of addressing the root cause, they shifted the programs again, moving some deeper into the facility, slowing others down, and quietly ending a few altogether. But even as they tried to pull back, the long-term effects on inmates and staff continued to surface. Morale among officers began to weaken. Some didn't want to participate anymore. Others felt trapped by orders. A few refused to work in certain units. This tension made daily operations harder, and a prison running under stress is a prison that becomes unpredictable. The inmates, meanwhile, grew more suspicious. They no longer trusted sudden movements, unusual medical checks, or unexpected changes in routines. Some believed the prison was hiding something dangerous. Others believed they were being watched more closely than before. The atmosphere changed. Fear mixed with confusion, and confusion mixed with anger. The breaking point wasn't a single event. It was the combination of all these small fractures that revealed something larger. The administration had gone too far, and the system could no longer support the weight of its own secrecy. This chapter ends where the real fallout begins, when word of the strange programs finally reached people outside the prison, and when officials were forced to explain things they had kept hidden for years. Every system that depends on secrecy eventually faces a moment it cannot control. For this prison, that moment arrived slowly, through small cracks, unexpected voices, and pieces of information that slipped past the walls. Chapter 5 explains how the truth finally escaped the place that was never designed to let truth escape at all. It began with letters. Inmates who had been through the hidden programs were afraid to talk inside the prison, but some found the courage to write to people outside. Family members, advocacy groups, religious volunteers, and retired legal defenders. Most letters said simple things like, "Something is wrong here," or "They are doing strange tests." Not all letters left the facility. Many were intercepted, but a few reached their destinations. The letters were vague, missing details, but they had one thing in common. They all described changes in behavior, strange conditions, and procedures that didn't match official prison policy. At first, outside readers didn't understand. Some thought the inmates were exaggerating. Others thought the letters described normal punishment. But as more letters arrived, the pattern became harder to ignore. A former legal advocate who received multiple messages later said, "When different people describe the same unusual thing, you start paying attention." The second breakthrough came from staff, not officers inside the programs, but lower-level employees who weren't part of the system. A maintenance worker noticed that certain rooms were being used much more frequently than normal. A kitchen worker questioned why new meal recipes were coming from supervisors instead of the food director. A nurse felt uneasy about being asked to perform repeated tests without medical explanation. None of these staff members knew the full picture. Each one had only a small piece. But when they spoke quietly to people they trusted outside the prison, friends, spouses, retired colleagues, their concerns added more weight to the inmate letters. The third major shift happened when a former officer retired and moved out of state. Away from the prison culture, away from the fear of retaliation, he began telling a friend about the strange programs he had been involved in. He didn't call them experiments, but he described conditions that matched perfectly with what inmates had written. His friend happened to have connections with a small nonprofit that monitored prison conditions. When the story reached the organization, they began collecting information. Within months, they had multiple inmate letters, notes from low-level staff, descriptions from a retired officer, old medical records with unusual patterns, internal logs showing unexplained movements. None of these pieces were enough alone, but together, they suggested something far bigger. The nonprofit filed an official request for documents. The prison responded with tight, carefully crafted statements. They denied everything, insisting all procedures were part of standard security. They refused to release certain logs, citing confidentiality. They insisted the allegations were misunderstandings or inmate exaggerations. But the pressure had started. Around this time, a journalist from a regional newspaper began asking questions. He had a history of covering criminal justice issues and knew how to recognize unusual patterns. When he saw the letters, vague but consistent, he became interested. When he compared them with staff comments, he became concerned. When he saw the prison's defensive responses, he became suspicious. The journalist visited former employees, contacted families of inmates, and reviewed old reports from the facility. He didn't uncover proof of full-scale experiments, but he uncovered enough inconsistencies to raise new questions. Why were some medical tests done repeatedly without explanation? Why were certain inmates moved to hidden units that didn't appear on public maps? Why did logs show movements that didn't match written policies? Why were some housing areas kept under extreme conditions? The prison administration began to feel the pressure. They had always relied on silence. But now silence was breaking. When the journalist requested an interview, the prison refused. When he requested documents, they delayed. When he asked to tour the facility, they denied it. This only made the story stronger. A few months later, the nonprofit released a short public report summarizing the concerns. It was careful, factual, and based only on verifiable details. But even without mentioning the full extent of the rumors, the report drew attention from lawmakers, advocacy groups, and local media outlets. The administration attempted damage control. They denied every claim. They held press briefings. They insisted that all procedures were lawful and that inmate complaints were false. But their explanations were thin, and their refusal to provide transparency only raised more suspicion. Inside the prison, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Officers felt observed. Supervisors grew nervous. Inmates believed change might finally come. Some staff members started keeping more detailed notes in case investigators arrived. A few openly refused to participate in certain procedures. The administration quietly scaled back the programs. Temperature changes became less extreme. Food modifications stopped. Sensory manipulation slowed. Some hidden rooms were cleared out. But these changes were too late. The outside world was already watching. The journalist eventually published a long investigation. It didn't accuse the prison of illegal human experiments directly, but it laid out every suspicious detail, every unexplained practice, and every strange pattern uncovered. The investigation didn't prove everything, but it proved enough to force official action. The state announced a review. Inspectors arrived. They requested documents, interviewed staff, and questioned supervisors. They didn't uncover every secret. Many records had been destroyed or never created. Many officers stayed silent. But the pressure forced the administration to permanently shut down the hidden programs. The experiments ended not because someone confessed, not because someone exposed every detail, but because too many small truths escaped the walls at the same time. Inmates later described the change as a quiet victory. There were no celebrations, no announcements, but the air inside the prison felt different. The fear wasn't gone, but it wasn't the same. The authority of the administration had cracked, and once a system built on silence develops cracks, it never becomes whole again. This chapter closes the story with a simple truth. Even the most dangerous prison cannot hide forever when people begin to speak. In the end, this story is not only about one prison or one set of hidden programs. It is about what happens when power goes unchecked, when isolation becomes a tool, and when human beings are treated like objects instead of people. For years, the voices inside these walls were ignored. Their warnings were dismissed. Their experiences were kept in the dark. But silence never lasts forever. One letter led to another. One retired staff member spoke honestly for the first time. One curious journalist asked a question the administration didn't want to answer. From these small steps, a truth began to form. A truth strong enough to reach beyond fences, watchtowers, and miles of empty land. The experiment stopped not because the system admitted wrongdoing, but because too many people finally noticed the same strange patterns. Too many lives showed the same signs of pressure. Too many questions demanded answers. And once attention arrived, the prison could no longer hide behind secrecy. This story is a reminder that even in the darkest places, truth has a way of escaping. It moves through letters, through memories, through the courage of people who refuse to stay silent. And once that truth reaches the outside world, change becomes possible. Thank you for watching this documentary. For more real stories from inside America's most hidden and dangerous prisons, make sure to subscribe and follow the channel.